but we're rolling.
All right, man.
Daniel, Duane.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Vancast.
Thank you.
Man, we're here in San Francisco. Man, this is like a dream come true to me. I heard about you from actually watching Valley Uprising.
Oh, right on.
And then I was in Bookshop Santa Cruz. I saw this book with El Cap on the front of it. And I was like, what's this? I saw your name and I was like, I've seen that name before.
Oh, right on.
Valley Uprising.
Yeah.
But first, feel free to introduce yourself and then we can get into all that.
All right. Well, I'm Dan Duane, and I'm a writer. So I've been writing books and magazine articles about all kinds of things, but especially about climbing and surfing for a long time, for a really long time.
So where did it begin for you? Writing or surfing, climbing? What came first?
Well, that's a good question. They both kind of came just straight out of family for me. My mom was a writer, and my dad had grown up in Santa Monica, grown up in sort of Westwood in LA, but had sort of grown up spending summers on the beach in Santa Monica and Balboa Island. And he had a younger brother. He's still alive. So my dad has a younger brother who's was a trestles guy and lived in North San Diego County he still lives down there. So North San Diego County surfer for forever and ever. And he was just kind of that cool uncle that I grew up wanting to be like, my Uncle Jim. When I was like in my early teens, my dad and my Uncle Jim, my surfer uncle, got into climbing in Yosemite. And so then they started like driving up to the valley all the time and climbing together and going up to the meadows and climbing all the time. And I guess for them, that would have been like late 70s, early 80s. So it just kind of put those two, I wanted to be like my dad and my uncle, And then my dad started me on climbing a little bit in high school, but more when I was in college. I came home from college for a few summers. I went to college in upstate New York, and I came home for college a few summers. And one summer my dad was training, in the summer of 87, my dad was training to do for Half Dome. He was sort of up in the mountains, spending a lot of time to get ready to do Half Dome. And my uncle was up there training with him, getting him ready, and they sort of invited me to go up for a weekend. And so I drove up by myself to the meadows and met them by Tenaya Lake, and we did South Crack on Stately Pleasure Dome. And, I kind of felt like struck by a lightning bolt there. I felt like, oh my God, all my questions have now been answered. I know what I want my life to be. So it was sort of climbing first, and then but then as soon as I graduated, I kind of graduated from college with this in 89 with this, it's sort of funny to look back on it, but like I just had this overwhelming imperative to surf, like I must surf. I must learn how to surf and become a surfer. I don't know why. And clearly it had to do with my uncle, but I don't know. It just was like, it was just the number one fixation of my whole life when I graduated from college was to surf. So I did. So I started surfing. Yeah.
Was that before you'd ever surfed and you just felt this calling?
Yeah. I'd done it a little bit. Like my uncle, I had gone, I think when I was probably 12 or 13 or something, my dad took me down to San Onofre and we camped out on the asphalt at San Onofre with my uncle and longboarded. And then I think once in college, I drove down to Leucadia and had another kind of go around with my uncle in Leucadia. And I know at some point he bought a used board for me. And I met him at Halama, which is, Central California, right near Point Concepcion. And he gave me the board. And that was where I first stood up on a wave. But it was, you can't really learn to surf like that. To learn to surf, you got to really log the time. So it wasn't really until I graduated from college, I think I had this kind of aching sense of like, oh God, I should already be a surfer. This is so, I'm so late to the party, man. I got to get going. So.
I almost feel like the same way because I did junior lifeguards in middle school there at Cowell's Beach.
Oh yeah, cool.
But a lot of my friends surfed and I wasn't doing that yet. And I'm like, I feel like the one weird kid who's not surfing yet.
Oh.
So I had that same kind of feeling.
Yeah.
Like, I need to go do this. So climbing and surfing, two of these things that can be like really, I feel like really intense, but also really calm. And they also lend themselves quite easily to like the visual arts. I have a lot of friends who do film and photography. So when did the writing about these things happen for you?
Well, like writing was the thing I always wanted to do, you know, like when I was 15, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do when I grow up, it'd be like, I would have said I want to be a writer, but, and I majored in creative writing in college, but, what really did it was right when I graduated from college and I moved home to Berkeley and just moved back in with my parents. There was a guy in our neighborhood, a friend of my parents, you know, his name's Tom Farber, and he'd published a whole bunch of books. And, you know, I mean, he really just like one day kind of like leaned out the door as I was walking by and was like, you know, come here, little young man, and said, your mom says you want to be a writer. And I said, oh, yeah, I want to be a writer. She says, all right, what are you into? And I said, well, I'm really into climbing right now. All right, you're going to write a book about climbing. Here's how it works, you know. And then he just told me what to do. And I threw myself at it super hard. I mean, I really brought it. But I had this incredible mentor. I mean, he'd published a lot of books at that point. And he kind of just walked me through the entire process. He like held my hand through from the idea to when it was done to sending it to his agent to getting it, you know, and then that got it, my first book published. And by that point I was in graduate school at UC Santa Cruz. I was getting a PhD in American literature there, and I had chosen Santa Cruz for the surf, you know, for sure. So that book came out, and then he was like, "All right, your next book's about surfing," because by that point I was super hooked on surfing, and here's how you're going to do your next book. So I had a lot of help. I had a mentor, got me going really early, you know, early in life.
Writing, it sounds like writing and surfing, you had somebody kind of showing you the way.
Yeah,
I
did. You know, surfing I did in that I had that uncle and I went with him a few times, but in climbing I sure did in the sense that my dad and my uncle my dad like just fully indoctrinated me and fully initiated me into kind of the way of the Yosemite climber as he had learned it from some old timers. And he had met a lot of, my dad is a really nice, really genial, friendly guy. He's really good at making friends. He's fun to be around. And so even though he didn't start climbing really until he was like 40, he quickly was friends with all these great climbers who were his age, which guys who were 40 and like 79 were guys who'd like Galen Rowell. They were guys who'd been who'd really been around. But in surfing, although I had this role model of my uncle and he'd given me I guess he'd given me some pointers once or twice. That was really more like just paddling out at First Peak Pleasure Point in 1989 on a 510 Schroff twin fin, this tiny little 70s twin fin that my uncle got me without a freaking clue. And there was no internet back then. There was no YouTube. There was no way to learn and I didn't know anybody. I literally didn't know a single surfer in Northern California when I started doing that. So it was kind of, when I look back on it, it's like, it seems kind of rugged, you know, it seems a little like, wow, I guess my hunger was pretty strong, you know, because I didn't even know the rules of the road well enough to know that like, and in 80, as I'm sure you know, like back then, the crowds were probably smaller than in sheer numbers than they are now for sure, but they were more, I think they were more fiercely territorial. Like I think particularly in Santa Cruz, like the pack of locals at a place like Pleasure Point was really hierarchical. And I didn't even know that. I mean, not only did I not know anybody, I didn't even know that was the deal. And so I would just paddle like right into literally be like, oh, it looks like it's best right there at First Peak, I guess. I'll just paddle right into that group of guys and the water's public, you know, I can take a wave. And I just would like take off on things and wipe out and get in people's way. And some, little kid would scream at me, you jerk. And I'd be like, well, he's just a little kid. I don't give a kid, without realizing the kid's like a total local, And so I had a pretty rough indoctrination for a while there.
That is so my experience to beginning surfing too.
Yeah.
I went to a shop really close to Pleasure Point, bought it was like this green, way too short for a beginner, and just, I think the first time I took it out, I went by myself out to Steamer Lane.
Oh, yeah.
And just didn't know what I was doing. People are yelling at me. Yeah. I remember somehow getting up, not standing up for any considerable period of time, and just eating it. And then 10 waves just pounding you, and your head is frozen and not fun. But it wasn't until I met a guy who was from Hawaii years later who, we got on the wave storm and went out to Cowell's.
Oh, cool.
did it way smarter rather than
right
just
on, right on.
jumping in. But it's exciting. But
Do you remember what the shop was that you bought a board at?
oh my gosh, if I heard the name, I would remember. It's like the size of this van. It was super
Yeah.
small. It's near Portola and 41st. It's like on the corner there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember the name, but I think I sold it back to them. I'm like, not for me. And then years later, I got on the Wave Storm, which was more my speed. But how did you get introduced and involved with, I guess, the Yosemite legends and eventually involved with Valley Uprising?
In the 80s and the early 90s was the scene of a lot of sport climbing activity. There were zillions of new routes going up. There was like tons and tons, like, because the Tuolumne Granite, there's not a lot of places for natural pro, and the sort of old school Yosemite climbing ethic as a result kind of kept people from exploring a lot. You know, there just were like oceans of granite up there with knobs on them that nobody was really exploring until like all of a sudden it was okay to put in bolts. And then there was this kind of gold rush of routes, of new route activity. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that as a result, in the late 80s and early 90s in the Meadows, there was a really intense scene there. Like Steve Schneider would be there every morning, and the Meadows, and John Backer was they're often like right in front of the Tuolumne Meadows grill. It would be like, Steve Schneider, Tommy Herbert, John Backer, Ron Kauk, like all these guys standing around kicking a hacky sack together. And Tom Herbert's dad, T.M. Herbert, was around still. I wasn't a special climber, I was like just average Joe. I was super into it, so I was really, really committed to it. I just mean I wasn't special in ability or anything, but I was around a lot, and that's just kind of who was there, so that's how I kind of ended up meeting people. And then when I wrote that El Cap book, that helped, right? Because the El Cap book allowed me to like call up Robbins and interview Robbins and Harding. I got to go like spend an afternoon with Warren Harding. And
what was that like?
Story. It was kind of heavy. I mean, he was a neat guy, but he was really, the stories about him being a drinker are pretty real. And he was in very late stage process of like drinking himself to death at that point. So it was pretty, he was super nice and genial and good guy and told great stories, and it was really an honor to be around him and all that. So it's not like he was a sloppy drunk or anything. He wasn't. I just mean that it was painful to see. It was like sitting there he was with some friends over by Tom's place. You know where Tom's place is on the east side?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's that it's a little nothing of a town. Yeah. So he was just like living in, I think, like an Airstream trailer at a campground by a creek over there. It was a kind of a sweet scene.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was kind of the beginning of that connection. Yeah.
Climbing is cool. It's such kind of like a small community. Like it's really neat when you have, like for me, I run a lot, and it's pretty easy for me to meet like a lot of my running heroes, for example, because they're not like these celebrities that you are so untouchable you couldn't like go see them at a race and talk to them or something. Climbing is like that too, because like I told you Dean Fidelman.
Yeah.
Do you know Dean?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Dean. Yeah. He's a cool guy. And it's like these people, they're just so friendly and so willing to just talk to you about their experiences. Like, I'm sitting here with you. But and another guy I read in one of your articles, handing over the sharp edge.
Oh yeah.
You mentioned Ken Yeager.
Oh, yeah.
So I interviewed Dean outside the Yosemite Climbing Museum. And,
right on.
And I walked in that morning, and him and Ken were talking about photos and stuff.
Yeah. I think I met Ken because, Bullwinkle, I think I met just being around the valley. I wrote a profile of Alex Honnold in 2012 for the Times, and Alex was staying with the Yeagers at the time. And it was when he and Dave Alfrey were doing their like 7 and 7 thing, 7 El Cap routes in 7 days.
Wow.
And then I ended up just really, really liking Ken and his wife Sheree and his kids, and we just all became friends and stayed in touch.
What's that like, getting to like profile Alex Honnold and get to tell these amazing stories of people that do epic stuff?
It's funny, when I wrote that thing, he hadn't, that was years before he soloed El Cap. I mean, but he was already he was already a pretty amazing character. Yeah, I mean, that's like the great pleasure of journalism, I guess, is the great pleasure of journalism is like, getting to know people and hearing about their lives and having an occasion, sort of a work occasion, to really think about their lives and try to make sense of their lives. And that gig in particular was kind of great because I was getting to do it for, the Times Magazine it's like a big, long article where you get to really think in depth about things. And that was sort of a pleasure. And then, of course, it was this subject that I am really interested in and passionate about. So it was really, I remember writing this section of that article in which I had to put Alex in the context of like early free soloists and John Backer and Derek Hershey and Dean Potter, and sort of tell this lineage of Yosemite soloists. And I remember just feeling like, wow, this is such a treat to get to do this for the Times, because I also knew Dean Potter, and I had seen Backer around, but I don't think I'd ever really met Backer, and I certainly never met Derek Hershey. But my point is just that these guys were like heroes to me, and these stories were heroic stories to me. I guess I'm just trying to say it was really fun to feel like, wow, I get to write about like John Backer and Dean Potter for a general audience. What a treat, That's kind of what I mean about it.
You can hear the passion in your voice for sure. What's it like, when you go into a story for the Times, for example, which is already rad that you get to write for the Times, and you're doing something like you said, you have a lot of room to really get into the story and get into it in depth. What is your process, or does it vary depending on the story? What was your process for that Honnold story, for example? How do you get your mind right? Are you like a method actor where you like live that life and then write about it? What's your process for?
Well, like that one was kind of funny because I was a valley climber, So, I mean, I hadn't been up there I had kind of faded out of valley. I had a kind of a long hiatus with climbing between like, I climbed a ton in the valley from like 87 to 92 really. And then I got hooked on surfing and writing, and then, got married and had kids and did all these other things with my life. And then it wasn't really until 2012 or so. Is that right? One of my older daughter got really hooked on climbing. And I didn't even push her into it. She started at a gym, and then when she was 10 or 12 years old, she suddenly started saying, she'd heard all the stories about her grandfather and her dad in the valley. And so all of a sudden when she was 10 or 12 years old, she was like, Dad, take me to Yosemite. And I hadn't been climbing in the valley in a long time. And I would like do every few years, I would do some random climbing trip. I'd go do a backcountry rock cruise or, go whatever, but I wasn't anyway. But so I had kind of then I just kind of came back into it with a full heart, and had a whole second climbing life. Mm-hmm. But my point, I guess, is just that, there have been sports that I've covered and stories that I've covered that I don't have that kind of deep, rich personal history with. Mm-hmm. And then it may be, and that's pretty different. But like with that one, it was like, oh darn, my reporting obligation is I have to go to the valley for a week, and do the like valley low ride and, hang out in El Cap Meadow. And it just was kind of hilarious for me to have that be what I was doing for work.
It's a great job.
It was, I mean, it just was so much like going home for me.
Yeah.
It just was, that's what I really mean by that, is like, it was just so deeply home ground. Although, of course, part of what the deal was for me with Alex was like, not only, like I said, like I was a really I sort of did like standard walls and standard time. And so not only was I not even an elite level climber back in the late 80s, it was really intense to be hanging around with Alex then in 2012 and just go, wow, Jesus, standards are really different. I had this kind of Rip Van Winkle moment with that.
So you're watching him solo this wild stuff.
Yeah.
I've seen people solo, not at that level.
Yeah.
honestly makes me feel super uncomfortable watching it. What was it like? What do you think of it?
You know, I didn't see him solo all that much. Where I saw him soloing was actually just on campus, at UC Berkeley campus. I watched him solo a building there, which was pretty weird because it was he went plenty high enough to die if he fell. Yeah, that was really confusing. It was really confusing to watch. And part of what was so confusing was that he didn't break affect. Like he and I we're just chatting, like, right? We're like walking through campus, we're chatting, and he walks up to the graduate library and he's like chatting and putting on his shoes and chatting and like chalking up his fingers a little bit. And he's still chatting and he's like, you know, climbing up this wall and we're just still chatting. And I just am feeling, dude, wow, shouldn't you like stop talking or something? Like you could die. And, he's just fine, you know, he's just like, oh yeah, you know, and then like my sister this, and I grew up in Sacramento, and he's like 40 feet off the deck, 50 feet off. So it's like, well, now all the height doesn't matter anymore. Now you're in like death zone anyway. But then in the Valley, he was doing that 7 El Cap routes in 7 days thing. They would wake up at, I think 3 or 4 in the morning at Ken Yeager's house, wolf down some granola, you know, and then drive into the, you know, park below El Cap. And I think I just walked up to the base of one route with them. I can't remember which route, Lurking Fear maybe or something like that. I walked up to the base of one of the routes early in the morning and they blasted off. But then they're like done at noon or something, you know, or 2. They would come, I think literally like noon or 2 or something. They like, not only are they done, they would walk, you know, the East Ledges descent brings you back down sort of through the way that kind of through the manure pile buttress area, the Ranger Rock area. Yeah. I remember sitting in my car waiting for them there to connect with them after they'd finished a route. And they just came walking happily down the trail chatting. And like their rack and their gear was no different than, I mean, I'm sure it was in the details, but to the naked eye, it wasn't any different than somebody who's just done like After 6 or the Nutcracker or something. Like there's no haul bag. There's no big backpack full of survival gear. There's no like 3 extra ropes. There's none of this crap. They're just like 2 happy-go-lucky rock climbers. Like just walking happily down the trail as if it was the Nutcracker. That's pretty mind-blowing. A lot less. That was heavy for me. Yeah, that was heavy for me to see.
Man, it's an incredible film, Free Solo, too. Yeah. Just to put yourself in that space to even watch it on screen, you know, your hands start sweating and stuff.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Yeah.
But to get to cover it so intimately, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yosemite has this really interesting, I don't know what it is. It has this really cool effect of being able to be home, I feel like. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm not climbing as much as I used to, and I never was doing huge routes or anything. I remember bailing pretty low off of like Royal Arches, getting scared, you know, and
sure.
I'm a gym climber, we'll say that. But I don't know, there's something about being there that just has this infectious quality of being able to become home. Yeah. And when you go see those walls again, it's never any less amazing and awe-inspiring to see those walls. It's always like the first time. How does an assignment come in? Or do you kind of pick what you want to write about? What's that like?
Oh, you know, it's a little of both for me. So sometimes the phone rings and it's an editor saying, hey, I got something. Are you interested? But mostly it's more entrepreneurial than that. You know, mostly it's more a matter of my beating the bushes and thinking of stories and, you know, and then I'll sort of, you know, think of a story, think of a pitch or a story and then try to think, well, what magazine would that be best for? And pitch it to a magazine that way. And so
that's cool because you also have to have, you know, some level of knowledge about a subject, it sounds like, but then you also probably get to learn a ton about whatever the subject matter is.
Yeah, that's the really, really fun thing about sort of general interest magazine journalism, you know, that is the getting to just serially, you know, dive into one cool subject after another and learn all about it and go somewhere and meet a new person and see their world. I really like that.
Yeah. That's why I love doing this.
Yeah.
It's like this excuse to say, hey, I have this thing. Can I interview you?
Yeah.
I'm interested in what you have to say.
Yeah.
It's not just like, hey, can I talk to you just for fun?
Yeah.
Which I wish I could do. But, and you write about food too, right?
I did for a lot of years. I haven't been in the last few years. Early in my career, I was like, writing about climbing and surfing a bit. But back then, I mean, the whole print magazine industry has changed a lot. It's really shrunk a lot in the last 20 years. But although the industry was bigger back then, there wasn't nearly as much appetite for surfing and climbing content as there is now. So I pretty quickly figured out that if I wanted to make a living doing this, I had to write about other stuff. I had to have other topics. I couldn't just write about climbing and surfing. Because even though I wrote for the surf magazines a bit in the early days, like I wrote for Surfer magazine, but it just wasn't a living. The pay was really meager. And when our first daughter was born, it was kind of like somebody had to change the diapers, somebody had to put dinner on the table, and cooking sounded a lot more fun to me. So I got kind of hooked on cooking. I got super into cooking because I was like trapped at home and I couldn't climb all the time. I had to have some outlet, I had to have something to become obsessive about. So I got all obsessive about cooking. And in the middle of that, I got a phone call one day from an editor that I'd worked I'd written a piece for him for the Village Voice in New York, and he just called one day and said, "Hey, dude, I'm at Bon Appetit, and are you interested in food at all? I got an article I think might actually be kind of good for you and topic for you." And it was about truffles, those these sort of weird spore fungi that grow on the roots of Douglas fir trees underground, and it was about the Oregon native version of truffles. There's an Oregon species of them. But the gig was like fly to Oregon wine country for 3 days and hang out with these chefs digging up truffles, and then hang out with them while they cook these crazy elaborate meals, and then eat with these guys and drink wine with them and hear them talk about truffles. So it was like, wow. So I did that, and I wrote that article, and I got paid, and it was like, geez, that's a pretty nice deal. That's a pretty good gig, and it's not so terrifying as like, I don't have to risk my life doing some crazy adventure.
That's cool. You get like this opportunity to really obsess over a topic. Are you just like, whenever you write an article, like a long article or really anything, are you just like sick of it and you're like, okay, I'm going to post it?
No, I don't. It's more the opposite happens to me. I get really into it, and then I kind of don't want to let it go. It's more like it's hard for me to let the subject go. But I always have to, and have to move on,
When do you know that an article is ready? Because there's infinite ways to write something.
Yeah.
Infinite ways to cover something.
In journalism, of course, your editors have a big say in that. So it's not, it's not so much, when do I know? I mean, there's a point where I know that it's time to share it with an editor, but the editor will be the judge of when it's done.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I just kind of feel it. It's like, all right, I think this is far enough along to share it with somebody. I won't look like a fool.
How much do you write for, your own enjoyment, and then also what you think that people are going to connect with? Is it kind of a combination of the two as well?
At least in good magazine writing, there's sort of the same thing in the sense that my wife is also a journalist. She's a really, really high level magazine writer. I guess we haven't had this conversation in a long time, but we used to sort of talk about it. It's like, you go on let's say that truffle story, you go on a trip, come home, and then I got to sit down and write the story. So then the question, you're sort of sitting there asking yourself, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to structure this thing? What's going to be my opening anecdote, and what's it about? And we sometimes noticed, we had this idea that, like invariably you come back from a trip and like you go out with some friends, and there's like, oh, well, how was your trip to Oregon? We ate all the truffles. Oh my God, I was totally sick. Let me tell you. I mean, I just got, I gorged myself and blah, blah, blah. I tell them the whole story. And if you do that a couple of times, go out with friends, you'll sort of notice that there's a version that's starting to, gel a little bit.
Yes.
And that's usually the best. That's usually becomes the starting point for the written thing, is like, well, so, I mean, it sounds sort of cheap, but it'll be like, well, what's the cocktail party version of your story? Because usually the cocktail party version actually does contain the nugget of the sort of funnest way of telling telling the thing and the most relatable way of telling it.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That just clicked for me. I'm like, wow, if I tell a story about something that happened to me, I start to like see, you're kind of like almost seeing what people are reacting to also.
Yeah.
And then
yeah.
I had this, so I used to work for the 49ers.
Oh, cool.
And doing like video operations.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, do you follow football at all?
No.
I don't either.
Yeah.
I didn't know who Jimmy Garoppolo was. My mom had to tell me who the quarterback was before I started. And I was walking in the hall one day and this guy was like standing in the doorway. And I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. He's just like stopped in the doorway. So I'm going to help him and I'm going to open the door a little bit. And he didn't move. And so I finally was like, excuse me, do you mind if I get by? This guy turned around and he looked really, really mean, like angry, just looking at me. And he just stared at me. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get out to the practice field. And then he just continued to stare at me. I'm like, oh, well, I'm sorry. I'm Nick. What's your name? And he just stared at me. And he goes, my name's Jed. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh, okay. Nice to meet you. Like by that time, I put my hand down. This guy is just not having it today. I go out to the field and I mentioned it to someone. I'm like, do you guys know someone named Jed? Just had this really weird interaction with this guy. Nick, that's the owner of the team.
Oh, funny.
And I don't even know what I did to this day. I'm like, I was just trying to get by. I think because he probably was like, why don't you know who I am? Kind of.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's interesting to think about the cocktail party version.
Yeah, and that would be a classic anecdote to start a magazine profile with. That'd be a classic kind of anecdote that somebody would start with because it would capture some, like if you were writing a profile of that guy, you know, if you were writing a profile of Jed, whatever his name is, you know, that'd be a great anecdote to start with because it so conjures that, you know.
I like that. Jed, whatever his name is. That'd be a great name for him.
I'm not paying attention. I don't care who owns the 49ers, but good for him.
Okay, so Lighting Out was, again, like the book I read, was that, how much of that was true?
Pretty much all of it.
Yeah?
Yeah, 99% or something like that, 98%. Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I reread it. I reread it again at the beginning of the pandemic.
Oh, cool.
I was living at my grandma's house. I would go in the backyard and I'd hang a hammock between this old rusty like card, you know, jack or whatever. And I would read that book. And the way you write, writing's cool because it's not a photograph, but it creates like these images in your head. So I was able to escape to assembly through your writing.
Cool.
Yeah, that was cool. How did you decide to write that one?
So that was that first one I mentioned that this neighbor was like,
what
are you doing after college? And
got it.
I said, I'm climbing a lot. And he said, just start taking notes. You know, I just really wanted to write. And that was the life I was living. So it was really a matter of a writing mentor saying, you should just write about the life that you're actually living, and here's how you should do it. So he kind of started by saying just, you know, for the next 6 months or whatever, just keep a journal every day of everything that happens when you're climbing. You know, when you're driving to go climbing, when you're driving back from climbing, when you're sitting around with friends talking about climbing, when you're reading about climbing, you know, everything you eat, you know, every place you stop, just all of it, every little bit of dialogue between friends or strangers. And so he sort of taught me how to harvest material from the world, I guess.
I was going to ask, like, how long after did you, like, go on a climb and then write about it? Because I was like, after time, this story could kind of change in your mind, right?
Yeah,
so you're taking notes all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a favorite climb that you did that was either included in that book or not?
The climb that was kind of the, you know, my biggest and most majestic climb was the Salathe wall route on El Cap, which is basically the route that Alex free solos, right, in that movie. He's soloing like a variation of that. I really just love a good long, moderate to easy romp from way up high. You know, I just love the feeling of cruising over a lot of rock.
Yeah.
Way up high.
And when you're up like on Salathe, looking back, can you even imagine being unroped for something like that?
Yeah. No.
Did you ever end up doing, was it Washington Column with your daughter?
You know, we didn't. We were going to do it. We were like committed to doing it right in we were going to do it in the spring of 2020. And then COVID, hit and the park closed. And then she went off to college and she goes to Deep Springs College. Have you heard of that place?
No,
it's
what is that?
It's a 100-year-old 2-year college on a working cattle ranch east of Bishop in the White Mountains.
Okay.
And it's super academically rigorous. It's really intense academically, and there's no tuition or anything. It's completely free. So every kid goes on a full ride, but they work like hell. So they actually work this cattle ranch. So the students are, there's a ranch manager and a farm manager, but the students are the labor force of a ranch and a alfalfa, and I found that like they sell alfalfa to other ranches. So they grow alfalfa to sell. And they grow vegetables to eat, and they grow hogs and chickens and turkeys to eat, and all their eggs to eat. So they have this very like self-sustaining operation, and then they're all reading like Kierkegaard and Hegel and really hardcore literature.
That's cool.
Yeah,
wow.
It's really intense. So but it's pretty consuming. So right when we were going to do our wall together, COVID hit, and then she got into that school and took off, and
yeah.
So we've been talking about, well, I know it probably will. It probably will when she's like maybe next summer when she's done or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Before, I know you have limited time, but I want to ask, so then getting involved with Valley Uprising.
Yeah.
I know that movie front to back.
Oh,
like
really?
I said, that's how I recognize your name from the book. How did you get involved with that? Was it just, again, knowing that group
You know
of guys?
what it was that I had, so like when I went up and stayed with the Jaegers to start, to get to know Alex, to write that article about him, the Sender Films guys were also staying at Ken's place. Oh, wow. And they were making a Real Rock. I think they were making like a Real Rock segment about Alex, probably about the 7 and 7 thing. I'm not sure. And so they did a little like, hey, well, while you're here, would you mind being a talking head? And I was like, oh, sure, no sweat, and then they knew what I was working on, and we got to know each other. They're really good guys. And then I think I did a trip for National Geographic Adventure magazine where we rafted the Grand Canyon with Tommy Caldwell and Beth Rodden, so that Tommy and Beth could like look for new routes in the Grand Canyon. And Pete Mortimer, who's another one of the two principals in Sender Films, was along. So we had a super good time. They're great guys. They just were like cruising around gathering documentary footage, I think, and they came to my house, and I had written that book about El Cap, and so I think they just were like, I don't know, I just kind of knew them, and they dropped by my house and were like, hey, could we just interview you on camera? We don't know where this is going. And I swear, I think that was in 2013 or 14. It was a long time ago. We did a pretty long interview, and then I never heard anything from them for a really long time. And then I bumped into those guys somewhere. Maybe it must have been either when I was doing the Alex thing or the Grand Canyon, and they were like, oh, hey, by the way, do you remember that interview we did a long time ago? Okay, so that's finally going to be a film, and you're pretty, like, there's a lot of you in it. We really ended up using a lot of that interview.
You're in the trailer, everything.
I know, right? And I was like, really? And they're like, yeah, it's kind of like a lot. Are you cool with that? And I was like, of course I'm cool with that. And then when it came out, they did a premiere. They did like a whatever,
like the Real Rocks.
They did a show. Yeah, they did a premiere, whatever you call it, showing of it at a theater in the Presidio in San Francisco. And it actually was sort of hilarious. They had told me like, dude, you should come, and we've got tickets for you. And I was psyched, but it was really funny. I brought my daughters, and my wife came, and my wife's mom came. And my wife's mom is awesome, but I just remember sitting next to my daughters and my mother-in-law. There's like, and then we dropped acid, and then we got high, and there were chicks, and it was just like over and over again. And then this new generation came along, and they dropped acid, and it was just like, oh man, okay, sorry, Judy. But I was also super proud of it.
Yeah, that you should be. That's so cool.
Yeah.
You're doing something that you're passionate about, and tons of people are being inspired by it. Do you think it's just a matter of you've been able to go on all these cool adventures and be a part of cool projects because you're just passionate about something, so it just connects with people who are passionate about the same stuff?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I guess it helped that my parents' basic messaging in life was like that. My parents' basic messaging in life was whatever you love, do it hard, And Berkeley was also, the Berkeley of my childhood was really that kind of town. Like Berkeley's changed a lot, but the Berkeley of my childhood was like, I don't know, like one of my dad's best friends had been a lawyer, and then he started writing self-help legal books, like How to Do Your Own Divorce, and they did pretty well. So then he just changed his life so that he would work 6 months out of the year, and the other 6 months, what he really wanted to do was be a fine art painter. So he would spend 6 months out of every year, mostly in Paris, in painting. And then
Wow.
and he just lived in a very modest house so that he could do that. And we just knew a lot. We knew a lot of people in Berkeley who lived very modest material lives so that they could have this, so that they could chase whatever brought them joy. So I was really, those values I think are not very prominent in the culture right now. But
yeah.
it's not really the way our economy is set up right now, but it was a big part of my upbringing. And I think it kind of gave me this clear vision of trying to live that way.
That's so important for people to hear, because I know so many people who chase after money or living like a lifestyle. You see Instagram influencers who are living in, tropical paradises, and it looks like their life is glamorous all the time. And I even personally know people who want to live a certain lifestyle or have a certain look to it. It would be exhausting. And you may or may not make the funds to continue to have that, but at the end of the day, you're going to really feel fulfilled from putting on the act. I don't know. So I think that's so important. What would you tell to somebody who wants to make their career as an artist, or more specifically a writer?
Well, mostly that writing is a craft. It's I mean, there's a lot of art to it if you're writing novels, or what if you're writing fiction or poetry or something, but it's a trade like any other trade, and it can be learned. I guess one of the things I'm sometimes struck by with younger writers is, and I was the same way. I mean, I had to be taught this too, so it's not like I just was naturally knew this. I just got lucky and was taught this early, but it was just that like I write probably 30 drafts of every even just a magazine article for Wired magazine or something. I don't just write 2. It's literally like 30. And that's kind of a bummer to hear, because it's like, oh, really? That's a lot of work, man. But really, it should be liberating news, because that's what it's like for everybody. Everybody who really makes a living as a writer. First of all, it's like an idiotic thing to do if you don't really need to. If you don't have an actual authentic craving to it, you'd be insane to try to make a living as a writer, because it's a long way around to a buck. But if you do feel like that's your, for someone who does feel like that's it, that's my dream, that's what I want to do, you gotta just like go all in hard for years and years and years, and like devour massive amounts of beautiful prose, reading. I mean, read gorgeous, gorgeous prose all the time. Read the New Yorker cover to cover, read beautiful books cover to cover all the time, every day, just so that your brain is like absorbing and ingesting the rhythms of good language. And, it's beyond that, there's sort of no mystery,
Yeah. For you, when you read so much, I mean, I'm sure you read all the time. How is it hard to still find your own voice? I always think of like people who are like comedians who talk about their own act and how they pick up like not necessarily even just the rhythm, but almost the style of another comedian. How do you find your own unique style when you're consuming so much content? I think about that in my own filmmaking.
I think you just have to go through that. I think everybody just has to go through it. You have to imitate. There's no escaping that, I think you just have to imitate masters and embrace imitating masters for a long time until your own voice starts to emerge and you figure out who you are. And
Where can people find your writing? all over, but more specifically, anywhere that you want the people to go.
To go look.
Is it
That's a perfectly good
DanielDuane.com?
place right there. That works. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
I really appreciate you coming on the Vancast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's a treat.
Hope to connect soon. All right.
Good.
Top of my game, looking down at the rack.